Welcome to the Atlas Network. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these videos travel. Alright, imagine a world where the Byzantine Empire didn't collapse, didn't fade, didn't break, but reformed at its peak and kept going for 1,000 years. Let's dive into the world we could have had. Alright, let's rewind to the year 1025. Byzantium is sitting on top of the world, richest city on earth, strongest walls ever built, a navy that literally shoots fire, and an emperor, Basil II, who spent 50 years breaking anyone dumb enough to challenge him. This is usually the point where the empire starts its long slide downhill, but not in this universe. Here, Basil's reforms don't die with him. They expand. The court locks corruption down so hard that governors lose the ability to steal land from soldiers. The theme system, which real history let rot, gets rebuilt like a modern bureaucracy. And instead of cheaping out on defence, the empire invests its enormous treasury into creating Europe's first true standing army. What this means is simple. When the Seljuk Turks show up in the 1070s, they don't find a weakened Byzantine frontier. They run directly into Cataphracts, armoured lancers so heavy that Arab poets wrote their hooves struck sparks like stars. Here's a detail most people don't know. The Byzantines trained their cavalry to fight in rotating waves, like medieval shock troops with relay tactics. That system never collapses in this timeline, so instead of the Battle of Manzikert being the beginning of the end, it's the moment the empire traps the invading forces, destroys them, and pushes east. Anatolia stays Byzantine. That single change reshapes the entire Middle East. By 1100, the empire controls all of modern Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, northern Syria, and parts of northern Iraq. They do this not just through force, but through one of their favourite tools, diplomacy, so sneaky it makes Renaissance Italy look like amateurs. Something people love learning. The Byzantines were masters of psychological warfare. They once blinded 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers, except left one man with a single eye to lead them home, and they timed it so they arrived on their king's doorstep in a single horrific line. The king died of shock. In our timeline, that level of intimidation means rivals don't push west. They push south or east. The Islamic world consolidates around Persia and Egypt instead of Anatolia. Now the Crusades begin, but they look nothing like the ones we know. Instead of going rogue and carving their own states, the crusading armies arrive to find Byzantium thriving, organized, and, worst of all, for European knights in charge. And because the empire didn't collapse, Venice can't bully it. The Fourth Crusade? Doesn't happen. In fact, the Venetians try to pull something shady, and the empire simply dissolves their trade privileges and sends the navy to blockade them. It's the medieval version of wiping a merchant republic off the leaderboard. By the 1200s, Constantinople is basically the medieval Singapore. Silk, spices, Egyptian grain, Russian furs, Byzantine coinage acting like a proto-dollar. And speaking of money, Byzantium had a currency, the solidus, that kept its value for 700 years. Nothing in human history compares. In this old timeline, the solidus evolves into a unified Mediterranean currency that Europeans love because it doesn't randomly devalue like everyone else's coins. Education spreads through the provinces. Greece and Anatolia hit literacy levels unheard of for the era, because the empire realizes early that the easiest way to maintain unity is to spread Greek language through schools instead of force. By 1300, the empire is stable, wealthy, and expanding scientifically. They preserve thousands of Greek manuscripts that would have disappeared forever. And because the Mongols hit the Middle East, but not Anatolia, the empire becomes the safe harbour for scholars fleeing destruction: Persians, Syrians, Georgians, Armenians. This creates a multicultural renaissance 4 centuries early. Imagine walking through Constantinople in 1290, Greek mathematicians debating with Syriac astronomers, Persian physicians teaching anatomy, Armenian engineers sketching bridge designs, merchants using the world's first state-run insurance program. Yes, Byzantium had that. In our timeline, this becomes the foundation for the explosive breakthroughs of Part 2. This is the first domino, the moment the empire stops falling and starts rising again. And when we move into the 1300s, the world will have no idea what's coming. Thinking on the 1300s now, The point where, in our world, the Middle Ages start to crack open. And in this world, the Byzantines hit their second wind. By this time, the empire isn't just surviving. It's become the place you run to if you're smart and don't want to die in some Mongol invasion or local feud. Persian astronomers, Arab physicians, Armenian engineers, Jewish merchants, Greek philosophers, they all funnel toward one city on the Bosphorus, because that's where the money is, that's where the libraries are, and that's where nobody's burning books this decade. Constantinople turns into a pressure cooker of ideas. Gunpowder arrives not as a toy, but as a research project. In our timeline, gunpowder kind of drips into Europe. Here the empire has state factories, military engineers, and a long tradition of weaponized chemistry thanks to Greek fire. They look at this strange black powder, shrug and say, "All right, let's see what happens if we put imperial funding behind it." Bronze tubes that once spat flame from ships get reworked into early cannon. City walls get redesigned from "nothing can breach this" to "nothing can even approach this" without being turned into scrap. The first proper artillery schools emerge, descendants of those old military academies that trained cataphract officers now teaching ballistics, metallurgy, and geometry. The army changes too. Heavily armoured cavalry doesn't vanish, but it stops being the only trick. You get mixed brigades, pikemen to fix the enemy in place, early gunmen to punch holes in them, and cavalry to finish whatever's left. They start experimenting with standardized drills centuries before Prussia thinks it's cool. Meanwhile, everyday life inside the empire shifts in quiet but powerful ways. Literacy climbs. The old system where only monks and bureaucrats can read and write starts to crack. If you're a merchant in Thessaloniki or a shipbuilder in Smyrna, you want to read contracts, tally accounts, study tide tables, decode foreign scripts. So small urban schools pop up, sometimes funded by guilds, sometimes by monasteries, sometimes by the state trying to raise useful citizens. Hospitals, which in real Byzantium were attached to monasteries and run like charitable institutions, evolve into something more modern. There's a permanent staff of trained physicians, not just monks copying Galen. Patients are separated by type of illness instead of just dumped into one large ward. They keep proper records, long-term case notes, even crude statistics. It doesn't look like a modern health system yet, but it rhymes with it. Economically, the empire starts turning into a monster. They already sat on the trade crossroads, now they deliberately weaponize that. Instead of letting Venice and Genoa siphon cash off Mediterranean routes, the Imperial Navy escorts state-chartered merchant fleets. Dock fees, tariffs, and customs checks become a science. There's an entire department whose job is literally to measure and tax everything that moves through the harbours. Grain from Egypt, spices from the Indian Ocean, furs from the Rus, silver from the Balkans. The imperial gold coin, the nomisma, has a reputation that money today would kill for. Other states periodically debase their currency to pay for wars. The Byzantines, burned by history, refuse. They anchor everything on a stable gold standard. Foreign merchants prefer to settle accounts in imperial coin, which quietly turns Constantinople into the closest thing the medieval world has to a global financial centre. While all this is happening, Western Europe is watching, very nervously. The Italian city-states had hoped to dominate Mediterranean trade. Now they're stuck negotiating with a gigantic organised empire that can shut off access to the east with a single decree. The Crusader states that once dreamed of independence, here they never really break away. They evolve into semi-autonomous frontier zones, governed by Latin nobles but answerable to the emperor, like rough border provinces with fancy cathedrals. Culturally, a strange fusion emerges. Drama and poetry from the Greek tradition mix with Eastern storytelling. You get epics that read like Homer rewritten by a Syrian mystic, love stories set not in some vague Christendom, but in very specific neighbourhoods of Constantinople, scientific treatises that quote both Aristotle and Persian mathematicians in the same paragraph. Timeline-wise, something big happens next. The intellectual spark that, in our world, lights the Italian Renaissance just doesn't leave home right away here. Instead of Greek scholars fleeing a collapsing empire and ending up in places like Florence, they stay right where they are, in an empire that's stable, rich, and very interested in paying for clever people. So the Renaissance doesn't start in Italy. It starts on the Bosphorus. You'd see it in architecture first. Old domes reinforced with new mathematical tricks, arches stretched further than before, entire districts rebuilt to show off imperial grandeur. Engineers experiment with double domes and hidden buttressing, learning how to make structures that look weightless but sit on hardcore engineering. Then you'd see it in art. Mosaics start to gain perspective, icons gain more depth, painters begin nudging toward realism, while still drenched in gold and symbolism. Portraits of emperors slowly stop looking like generic saint faces and start to resemble actual humans you might recognize. Then science begins to pull ahead. Astronomers working in imperial observatories refine planetary tables, improving navigation. Ship captains cross the Mediterranean faster, with fewer wrecks, because the empire quietly standardizes nautical charts. There's a moment where a Byzantine mathematician, working off Persian and Greek sources, gets uncomfortably close to inventing calculus 2 centuries early, not as a named thing, but as a set of techniques for describing motion and change. By the time the 1500s roll around, the empire is no longer just the old Roman thing hanging on. It's one of 3 gravitational centers on the planet: Ming China in the east, the rising Atlantic kingdoms in the west, and this immortal engine on the Bosphorus. The discovery of the Americas still happens. Sailors are still curious, currents are still there. But when gold and silver start pouring out of the New World, the Byzantine Empire is in prime position to plug into that system. They don't need colonies everywhere. They need strong fleets, smart deals, and a network of trusted banking families that can move money across continents. Socially, the empire has its own tensions. Old nobles hate the rising merchant class. Rural peasants resent city elites. Religious debates never stop, especially between conservatives who want to freeze the empire in some idealized 4th century purity, and reformers who say, look, either we adapt or we die, pick one. But underneath all that noise, there's continuity. A legal system that remembers Roman law, a church structure that keeps society glued together, and a habit, centuries old now, of co-opting outsiders instead of annihilating them. Viking bodyguards turned into Varangian Guard. Steppe cavalry turned into border regiments. Arab merchants turned into tax-paying citizens. As the 1700s approach, the empire is poised at the edge of another major transition. Coal and steam are starting to matter. Western Europe is tentatively pushing into mechanized production. Britain is getting noisy with factories and strange new engines. And for the first time in a long time, the Byzantines are facing something they can't solve with just walls, fleets, and clever diplomacy. The modern world is assembling itself, and the question becomes, does this 1,000-year-old empire manage one more reinvention, or does the age of steam finally do what swords and sieges never could? That's where things really start to bend the world we recognize. By the early 1700s, coal and iron start deciding who matters and who doesn't. In our world, that pivot belongs to Britain. Here, there's a second player in the game, a very old empire that's still annoyingly alive and sitting on the Bosphorus. The Byzantines don't invent the steam engine first. They're not magical. But when word spreads that some crazy Englishman has built a machine that turns coal into motion, the imperial court does what it's always done best. It poaches talent, copies the design, and then builds an entire administration around it. Railways arrive across the empire in the mid-1800s, not as private experiments, but as imperial arteries. One line hugs the coast from Constantinople to Alexandria. Another cuts through Anatolia to the Persian frontier. A third climbs north and through the Balkans, stitching together cities that in our world spent a century hating each other. Coal from Anatolia, grain from Egypt, textiles from Syria, copper from the Balkans, all of it now moves on steel rails under one flag. The knock-on effect is brutal for everyone else. The Suez route plus imperial rail means the empire can move Indian Ocean goods into Europe faster than any Atlantic port. Britain and France suddenly have a rival not just on the sea, but in the global trade map. By the late 1800s, the empire has gone through another internal reset. The emperor is still there, still wrapped in purple, but he's sharing space with an elected imperial assembly. Roman law gets updated into a civil code that looks suspiciously like a mix of French clarity and old Justinian logic. You can appeal a court case using legal language that has changed less in 1500 years than English has in 300. When the world starts sliding toward the First World War, the Byzantine Empire is no relic. It's one of the top 3 industrial powers on the planet. Territory-wise, it holds all of modern Greece and Turkey, the entire Levant, Egypt and the Suez Canal, most of the Balkans, Cyprus and Crete, and a string of fortified islands across the eastern Mediterranean. Population, around 120 million people by 1914. Economy, roughly on par with Germany and the British Empire's home isles. If you turned it into modern numbers, you're looking at maybe 12 or 14% of world GDP at that point. When war comes, it doesn't start with them, but there's no way they can sit it out. Austria wants influence in the Balkans, Russia wants warm water ports, Britain wants Suez, and everyone wants to be the friend of the empire without being its subject. The Byzantine side reluctantly, with Britain and France, mostly to keep Russia from dominating the Slavic south and to keep German industry from boxing them out of Europe. Their army is huge for the time. Roughly 3.5 million mobilized over the course of the war, with about 1.2 million under arms at any given moment. They bring something nobody else has at scale, a fully integrated Mediterranean theatre. Imperial fleets turn the Eastern Med into a no-go zone for enemy shipping. Rail lines from Alexandria to Constantinople feed men and supplies into the Balkans on a schedule that would make Prussian officers jealous. There's a detail that always hits people. This empire has been running complex logistics since it was sending grain from Egypt to feed Rome. Industrial war is just a new skin on an old habit. The Great War still shreds Europe, but the map afterward looks different. There is no dead Ottoman carcass to carve up. The empire keeps its territories. Instead of a Middle East drawn with random straight lines, you get provinces that have been integrated for centuries. The British Empire is weaker coming out of the war. France is traumatized, Germany is bitter, and Byzantium comes out bloodied but intact, with its navy and its trade routes still in one piece. Between the wars, the empire goes through its most dangerous moment: internal modernization. Workers want rights, ethnic minorities want recognition. The educated middle class wants more say. The empire responds the only way it can if it wants to avoid being torn apart, by turning more of its subjects into shareholders. The Imperial Assembly gets real power. Provincial councils gain more autonomy. Greek remains the central administrative language, but local languages, Arabic, Armenian, Slavic tongues, get space in schools and courts. Then the world collapses again in the 1930s and 40s. In this version of World War II, fascism still rises in Europe, but the map is different. Germany still turns into a monster, Italy still dreams of empire, but the Eastern Mediterranean is not an open door. It's a fortified lake held by a 1,000-year-old state that knows exactly how to deal with would-be Caesars. The Byzantine Empire fights on the Allied side again, but this time from the beginning. Its army in Wu-2 peaks at around 4.2 million under arms, with about 2 million in active combat roles. Its GDP during the war years sits in the top 3 globally, just behind the United States and roughly comparable to the British Empire. You'd have tank factories in Thrace and Anatolia, shipyards in Smyrna and Alexandria, turning out destroyers and carriers, aircraft plants outside Constantinople, building rugged twin-engine bombers designed for the mountains and the sea. The empire becomes the anchor for the Balkan front. There's no quick Axis sweep through Greece. Instead, Nazi forces get stuck fighting a technologically matched, battle-experienced army in miserable mountain terrain while Allied supplies flow freely through Imperial ports. By 1945, Europe is scarred, but the world order is different. The Cold War doesn't form as a simple USSR binary. It's a triangle: America, the Soviet Union, and an old empire that never died. The Byzantines are too capitalist to join Moscow, too independent to be Washington's junior partner. They build their own nuclear program in the 1950s, test a device somewhere in the Egyptian desert, and quietly become the third nuclear power. From the 1960s onward, life inside the empire starts to look more and more familiar to us. Mass education becomes fully universal. Every child in Constantinople, Cairo, Antioch, Thessaloniki, and Beirut grows up fluent in at least 2 languages, Greek plus whatever is local. Hospitals are free at point of use. The entire modern healthcare system is built on the old Byzantine idea that the state and the church should care for the sick, just now funded by taxes instead of monastery donations. Universities in Constantinople, Alexandria and Athens turn into major science hubs. By the 1980s, the empire is a world leader in shipping, energy transit and biotechnology. Owning both the Bosphorus and Suez is like holding two hands on the global throttle. Fast forward to 2025. The Byzantine Empire is still there. Territory-wise, it looks like this: Greece, Western and Central Turkey, and the Bosphorus as the core. The Levant, modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine and Jordan, Egypt up to the Sudanese border, most of the Balkans, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Albania, parts of Serbia and Bosnia integrated over centuries. Population around 260 million people. Capital, still Constantinople. A megacity of nearly 30 million, a vertical maze of glass towers, ancient walls, and neighborhoods that have been inhabited continuously since before Jesus was born. Economically, this empire is one of the top 3 powers on Earth. In current numbers, its GDP in 2025 would sit somewhere around 22 to 25 trillion US dollars, on par with or slightly below the United States, and in the same league as a unified European Union or China. It dominates global shipping. The world's largest merchant fleet sails under Imperial flags. Energy transit, pipelines and cables from the Gulf, North Africa and Central Asia run across its territory. Tourism, because where else can you walk from a Roman cistern to a medieval monastery to a glass tower in 10 minutes? And high-end medical and AI research. Long tradition of hospitals and math doesn't just go away. Military-wise, it's not the biggest in raw numbers, but it's serious. In 2025, you'd be looking at roughly 1.8 million active duty personnel, another 2 to 3 million in reserves, a blue water navy with 5 to 6 carrier groups operating in the Mediterranean, Red Sea and Indian Ocean, a heavy focus on air defense and missile systems ringed around its core cities, and a highly professional rapid deployment force descended, in name at least, from the old Varangian Guard. Compulsory service probably still exists, but in a flexible way. 1 year of military, cyber or civil service with the option to stay on as a career. Day-to-day life for an average citizen feels like a mash-up of Southern Europe and a very orderly Middle Eastern state. You wake up in an apartment block in Thessaloniki or Antioch, grab strong coffee and something drenched in olive oil, check the news in Greek even if your grandparents spoke Arabic or Slavic at home. Your kids learn Koine Greek in school for tradition, modern Greek for daily life, plus English and maybe one local language. Public transport is dense and overused. The skyline is dotted with domes and minarets turned into museums, sitting next to skyscrapers owned by shipping dynasties whose roots go back to a merchant who once traded under Justinian. Religion is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Orthodox Christianity is still culturally dominant. Feasts, icons, and saints' days shape the calendar. But the government is officially secular, running on a legal code that traces its DNA straight back to Roman law. Jews, Muslims, Catholics, and secular citizens all exist within the same framework, protected more by institutional inertia than by idealism. You don't tear down a system that's been tuning itself for 1,500 years. The biggest difference between our world and this one? There was always a grown-up in the Eastern Mediterranean. No Ottoman collapse, no Sykes-Picot borders, no power vacuum that drags half the planet into proxy wars. Instead, there's this old, stubborn empire, constantly reforming just enough to stay alive, always sitting across the table at every major negotiation. From Basel Sect in 1025 to quantum computers in 2025, the same state carries the memory of Rome forward. And somewhere in modern Constantinople, in a quiet neighborhood overlooking the Bosphorus, there's probably a small plaque on a crumbling wall that says in Greek, "Here stood the mint where the first solidus was struck, paid in gold, still paying dividends." Thanks for watching the Atlas Network. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment telling us what you want the next episode to explore. Your ideas shape where we go next. See you in the next one.